A second set of potential jurors will be questioned in Baltimore today in the trial of one of the police officers charged in Freddie Gray's death. Gray died in April after suffering a severe spinal injury during his arrest. The first of 6 officers on trial, William Porter, has been charged with manslaughter. The defense lost their bid to move the trial out of Baltimore, arguing that finding an impartial jury might not be possible.
We're joined now by New York Magazine contributing editor Benjamin Wallace-Wells. He took a closer look at the issues facing Baltimore in his new piece, A Most Violent Year, Baltimore, the Laboratory City. Benjamin, thank you so much for being with us. A really thoughtful piece, and for people who are not familiar with it, I highly recommend reading it. It was interesting, Ben, you wrote about how Baltimore had major problems long before Freddie Gray died. Tell us about where some of that tension between police and the community, where that stems from.
Sure. Baltimore's a fascinating place. You know, not too many people leave its neighborhoods, and so memories tend to build up and accumulate. In 2012 and 2013, in each summer, there was a police killing of an African-American man, which, though it did not spark national attention, and though the protests in Baltimore were small, sparked a kind of a local movement. So the man who was killed in 2012 was named Anthony Anderson. The man who was killed in 2013 was named Tyrone West. Tyrone West's sister, a school teacher named Tawanda Jones, each Wednesday from the time he was killed on, over the course of 2 years, staged a local protest against police brutality in a different neighborhood in Baltimore, not downtown, but in the places where somebody had been beaten or killed. And so by the time you get through Trayvon Martin, Michael Brown, and then get to Freddie Gray's killing, there's a local context where people who you talk to who were out in the streets during the Freddie Gray protests knew the names of Tyrone West and knew the name of Anthony Anderson, and they had a sense that, you know, there was a police department and a political structure that was not responsive, that, you know, that police brutality would be covered up, would not be dealt with. In both of those cases, the officers went free.
Ben, speaking of those protests, one very interesting detail about the protests that erupted after Gray's funeral, gang leaders, they were joining some of the cops to try to calm the crowds. Tell us why that's so significant.
I mean, I think it's really an amazing feature, and it sort of shows how upside down everything was in Baltimore for a while. You know, in the 3 weeks or so, the 3 or 4 weeks after the most vivid protests, people were not calling 911. The police pulled back. Half as many people got arrested. And so people turned to whatever local organizations they had. They turned to churches. In some cases, they even turned to gangs. So from the very beginning, leaders of the most violent and most well-organized gangs in Baltimore, the Bloods, the Crips, the Black Guerrilla Family, were meeting not only with police, but also with political leaders to try to see what they could do to turn the city back from violence. And I think when you think about the way in which these events were talked about, you know, the mayor came out and in what I think is understood now as a real error, said that the people protesting were largely thugs. And what's fascinating about the actual events, what actually happened, was that you had some of the people who were obviously thugs helping to prevent violence, and some of the people who were very community-minded, who were, you know, involved in projects of communal uplift, who were out in the streets. And so I think it just sort of points to the general confusion of categories that took place in Baltimore this summer, and how absolutely upside down everything was.
You know, Ben, I think one of the things that you raised in your piece that I thought was also so interesting is the notion that, you know, for people who are not within the community, it'd be difficult to understand, but there is an element of PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. When you look at the kinds of situations that people who are trying to go about their normal lives are confronted with when it comes to the violence, when it comes to sometimes the lack of leadership, the failure of leadership. Tell me a little bit about how you explored that issue, because you came across a group called the Violence Interrupters.
Yeah, remarkable people. So these are a program that exists in a few cities, in Chicago and Los Angeles, but is particularly involved in Baltimore. And it's a group of former gang leaders who work in neighborhoods where they grew up to try to stop disputes from escalating into violence. So they might hear that there's a kind of beef out there, and they race out into the streets and try to find the people who are upset at each other and try to kind of calm them down and keep them from shooting each other. There's a couple interesting things there's a couple interesting ways in which those people's view of violence is different from ours. One is, even though these are places where there's a lot of drug dealing and criminal organizations are very well established, they don't see like a lot of cold tactical killing. They often see a lot of kind of emotional heat. Somebody who years ago took out somebody else's father. And so in many ways, one of them gave me an example of a case that they were working on just as I was reporting the piece back in September, in which a boy found out that the man who killed his father had just gotten out of jail and moved back into his neighborhood. And the man who killed the father found out that the boy knew. And the violence interrupters, these ex-gang leaders, were convinced that both of these people, the man and the boy, wanted nothing more than to go straight. But because this is a city where there is, as some of the police told me, a lot of undiagnosed trauma, because there is an expectation that violence will be regular, both of these people were now really worried that the other person might be out to get him. And so you have a situation in which, which I'm told is sort of the norm, as regular as how violence happens, in which two people who are not geared to commit a violent act are suddenly worried and expecting that something may be done to them. And that's the kind of situation that breeds violence all the time. So the police officer I spent a lot of time with, a lieutenant colonel named Melvin Russell, his way of thinking about Baltimore is that, and he talks from his own experience as a cop and from working as a pastor in the community, is that the experience of violence is so universal that the modal experience of Baltimore is traumatized, and that because that is not diagnosed and expunged, it tends to repeat itself in further acts of violence.
Fascinating insight. Ben Wallace-Wells from New York Magazine, thanks so much for your time.
Sure, thanks for having me.